Helin, and this is Control.Freak. I'm interested in monsters. My interest in monsters is maybe explained by the anxiety the Jenks diagram gives me. It is, in itself, an excessively monstrous effort in classification, in a discipline that avoids easy dissection. The form of the diagram itself reveals an internal anxiety about classification. Its fluidity is a formal aversion to boxes. As a conformist, I'm eager to find out where I fit within the discourse of architecture. As a romantic eclectic, I'm interested in curating exotic and diverse interests. My time as a TA for Doug Graff taught me that architecture is, at minimum, a duplicitous discipline, or a clear challenge to Jenks's inane impulse. In my own recent projects, I've been interested in how history provides a useful catalog of form with particular associated effects, which can be recombined based on similarities, however monstrous they may appear at first. The Jenks diagram does, however, allow for a certain gerrymandering for the sake of inclusion. By tracing one's own interests, one might overlay a second monster claiming territory on top of Jenks's. I warn that this inclusion should always redline that seemingly benign yes is more mentality, in favor of a yes is horror mentality. I say this to distance myself from certain simplistic inclusion that makes no effort to find relationships and thinks architecture plays well with others. Monsters don't play well with others. Monsters are challenging to deal with, threatening, out of place, but worth paying attention to, if for no other reason than the fact that they produce an encounter and demand a response. In looking for monsters, one must understand that monsters are themselves a combination of fragments, which may contain several of the following characteristics. The first characteristic of monsters is that they reject ideality. Ideality in contemporary architecture begins with Colin Rowe's mythology of the ideal villa, in which he establishes a tartan grid as the ideal Palladian villa. And in his analysis of 11 villas, all 11 deviate from his own established ideal. The very idea of an ideal implies that an average is being made, which, if you think about averages, isn't too ideal. More recently, Greg Lynn has championed the idea of families. Lynn's embryological house project was his first attempt to create such a family. Instead of insisting on a mythical ideal, he designed, in his words, a coherent family of houses, none of which was more commodious, functional, or delightful than any other, as all were individually perfect. Like my children, different but equally lovable. Produced Glasgow's lines, or a physical manifestation resulting from an internal genetic hybrid. Monsters are carefully curated. They don't represent an arbitrary or capricious blending. They depend on a close fit, here illustrated by Iris Schieferstein, a German artist who works with dead animals as a medium. While horrific in familiarity, the close fit of differing bodies is surprising. Proficiency in curation depends on one's ability in finding similarity in seeming difference, a task aided by a large taxonomy from which to draw. In becoming hybrid, the parts redefine both each other and the original. An example of this is a greyhound in a Star Wars Imperial At Walker costume. The dog reanimates the original stop-motion movement of the At Walker, and the dog is reimagined as something that could have mechanical qualities. Monsters avoid complete assimilation in favor of being connected to a broader context. Monsters often seek a resolution between the organic and inorganic. Another example of this would be Chris Cunningham's robot in Bjork's All Is Full of Love. While their faces are capable of human movement, the automotive assembly robots are required for the Lovey android's animation. The android itself is a hybrid resolving the difference between human and machine by demonstrating similarity. Monsters operate in this space between the foreign and familiar, or the exotic and the primitive. Monsters insist that while you may have seen something like it before, you've never seen it like this. Monsters are growing and searching, and sometimes are the only thing with life in a dead city. Monsters are excessive. They allow for more heads, limbs, bodies, and species than is typical in human anatomy. Teratology, the study of abnormalities in physiological development, comes from the Greek word teratos, meaning monster or marvel. It specifically makes the case that excess, like polycephaly, and other bodily abnormalities is a monstrous quality. Excess would also include the doubling or multiple effect of cloning, in which case near reproductions or evil twins are given life. Monsters aren't an excuse for incompetence, but are skillful and precise combinations to produce architectural effects. They aren't awkward juxtapositions, but rather carefully crafted creatures able to produce difference while avoiding collage. Monsters are mythological rather than historical creatures, living in architectural lore. Sylvia Levin describes the mythical starting point that Logier's primitive hut served to substantiate a certain lineage of architectural history, and suggests we share an equal opportunity to produce alternative mythical origins for our own work. Myth avoids reality for the sake of usefulness and productivity. Architecture is the monster living in our myth. Architecture is a cabinet of curiosities in 5 parts. The history of monsters is inseparable from the modern museum, a relationship originating in the Cabinet of Curiosities. The Cabinet of Curiosities, or Wunderkammer, is an encyclopedic collection of objects whose categorical boundaries were yet to be defined. The content was by definition 1. Denatured and contextually fragmented, 2. Exotic, foreign, or otherwise liberally deviating from the familiar, and 3. Reassembled through denatured curation, where speculative new meanings surface free from the burden of context. At the heart of this curatorial hoarding was a superstition that one had control of the world through microscopic reproduction. The penchant to collect the denatured fragments grew from the hybrid desire to know our primitive roots, and a romantic impulse for the exotic, picturesque, and the sublime. The Cabinet of Curiosities became a container of monsters, providing ample material for mythical production. While still in infancy, the collections were capable of producing monstrous effects through the collective mass of otherwise normal fragments. As collections became uncontrollable, they grew out of shelves and oozed from vitrines, covering walls of entire rooms. What began as a cabinet of curiosities became cabinets of curiosities, or rather, the curatorial creature one might call a museum. At maturity, collections were able to secrete a solid calcium carbonate shell to hide their monstrous ensembles. The cabinet's limestone shells resembled architecture as a formal subdivision of rooms preserving a circular void. By 2004, the Japanese duo Sana took notice of this collective beast of teratological disproportions and its labyrinthine growth. They weren't disgusted or fearful, but rather they took pity, knowing that the monster would soon attract a dogmatic gaze and the accompanying fear that instigates witch hunts and dragon slaying. Sana made a deal with this devil to carefully dissect it and preserve it using the illusion of containment, saving it from its own impending doom. Under the cover of Kanazawa, Seijima Nishizawa surgically removed the museum's circular void that anchored the collections, stretching it thin until the cylinder lost all color, scaling it until it could enclose the cluster it once gave center. What follows is now legend, but the remaining artifact confirms this story. The collection of cabinets ceased its growth and instead scattered in desperation of loss until it could no longer move. The inadvertent discovery Sana made was by turning the museum inside out, the formaldehyde once preserving interior curiosities could be reused to stop the monstrous growth of the museum. It was a discovery that turned cabinet into curiosity. The freakish ensemble now sits in a state of repose, like a creature in a petri dish. Now that they've had time to study the curiosity, researchers found that the fragmented and denatured collections did in fact recombine and develop a method for monstrous growth. The growth at the moment is limited by a tissue fixative and resembles the creatures inside. This last example is no anomaly, for in London at 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields, an architect's collection grew to such epic proportions that it literally ate his house. Sylvia Levin describes this house as an excessive collection of antique fragments, books, mirrors, and buildings. A collection of houses filled with a collection of collections, an obvious sign of the interiority complex. While carefully preserved, hung, and curated, the sheer mass of the artifacts was overpowering. the antique and architectural fragments recombined until it became a unified body. At first, the curated body of works resembled something like a rococo surface, something foreign, exotic, and something undead. No one knows quite when it happened, but the monstrous body of fragments separated from the skin of the house, becoming two. And whether it ate the house, nobody quite knows, but these photographs remain. And when you look in the windows to the left and the right, where the collection once was, the rooms are empty, and in the center, a monster has taken the place of a facade. Take two. When Bernini questioned whether Satan had sent Borromini to destroy architecture, he may have been prophesying the coming of Corb, or Charles-Édouard Généré-Gris, that hybrid half-wit, half-painter, half-architect, half-Swiss watch engraver, half-French masterpiece maker, anything but a purist, doubly hyphenated, pseudonymous monster. The only thing that marks a complete change in Corb is the absolute transformation from a genetically neutral Swiss man to a wholly French revolutionary. He was mad, and he wasn't soon to relinquish his dear aphorism, architecture or revolution. When his plan to destroy most of Paris in 1922 was foiled, in what he was calling Plan Voisin, he patiently awaited another chance. By 1929, the opportunity arose, and a monster capable of destroying nearly all of Paris soon made its way from his atelier at 35 Rue de Sèvres to Rue de la Champs-Élysées. In a letter to his eccentric client, he carefully rephrased his resurrected plan. Parce qu'il propose une solution de toit de Paris, dont je parle depuis 5 ans. And indeed, it leveled the city. The monuments, however, remained, although in a severed state. At about the same time, Généré-Gris reproduced the same device in a villa, and made the device one of 5 points required for all modern architecture. While as a revolutionary device capable of leveling cities, Corb believed it was the savior from the dogmatic and vampiric academy. There are other monstrous qualities in Généré-Gris' work. For example, the way that the Villa Savoie is visually composed in 3 parts: ruinous roof garden, cyclopean free facade, and pilotis, which, I might add, pierce the ground with such conviction that I'm convinced they mean to inflict pain. In a way, Villa Savoie suggests the surrealist game, The Exquisite Corpse, as a paradigm for modern architecture. It's a game which builds hybrids from fragments based on a close fit. This architectural example is given by students from Lisa Tilder's studio. In their studio, they went so far as to rebreed the hybrids, producing the visual effect of multiple DNAs, or Blasco's lines. And perhaps this is why Corb insisted on rendering his work in stucco, to hide the trace of multiples. If one compares the Swiss work of Corb with his early French work, they'd find an expected transformation. The Swiss work is in an awkward transition as it unfolds into something modern. The blank square on the facade could have been a picture window in proportion, stretching to become a blank free facade with a ribbon window. In the surrealist way in which the ellipse windows are being squished and forced off the facade by the static figure of the square. Corb's pilotis begin to teeth, like an infant getting its first set of fangs. The curvilinear geometry of the pavilionizing ends will soon become internalized by the time Généré-Gris has molted into his animagus double, Corb. And thinking of other monster pieces, I'm reminded of Alto's Villa Maria. Doug Graff finds that despite the abundance of seemingly incompatible motifs, rhythms, textures, and materials, and being overwhelming and beyond reason, critics still find the Villa Maria to be a unified work of art, or an amazing, well-ordered, and orchestrated whole, characterized as a melting pot. This prestidigitation and joining gives Gideon reason to name Alto Magnus and Norden, or Wizard of the North. In Senetzlo, Alto breeds the banality of a government building with an Italian hill town, which Alto admires as the most individual and natural form in urban design. It's a breeding of differing scales and species, and reveals Alto's dark suspicion that Finland had something to gain from something so Italian. Graff suggests that Alto's unlikely pairings aren't arbitrary, but the result of similarities between the primitive, the vernacular, the classical, and the modern. If modern architecture was supposed to be a marriage between machine and architecture, its hybrid offspring is realized in Eileen Gray and Jean Badovici's E1027. The house not only had a model number rather than a name, but its identifier is a hybrid code of the designer couple's initials, intermingling and crossing like DNA. The house is a machine architecture hybrid, but was also meant to serve as a horcrux, storing the spirit of E1027's relationship in this machine-like object. So not only does machine and architecture produce a hybrid love child, but the resulting hybrid becomes the android known as E1027. And one could easily add Mies to our collection of alchemists for how he breeds the form of a Chinese courtyard house with the American suburban experience. In each of these cases, it's important to note the initial exoticism, denaturing, and repurposing needed to produce these resulting hybrids. Chapter 3. When Rem Koolhaas recounts the story of how Casa de Musica was conceived, he tells a story about the relative ease of architecture as a refiguring act. Back in the office, there were 2 weeks left to finish a competition of the concert hall in Porto. We had been wrestling with the myth of the shoebox, acoustically perfect, architecturally deadly. A blinding flash suggested that the Dutch house enlarged offered a way out. The family's tunnel could become the detested shoebox. Not only did this produce a satisfactory generic object for Porto, at a time when architecture is exhausted by icons, but it did the one job that is required in the music hall, hiding the acoustic box it houses. It's a monster, first of all, because it's a disfiguring or refiguring act, comparable to the geometric game of tangrams. As an object, it's something unclear, but most closely resembles a tortured state between sphere and cube, a sort of plagued French Enlightenment between Ledoux and future OMA projects, most notably the Prada Transformer, which tries to resolve 4 different unyielding faces into a single form. Second, it's a monster in its utter foreignness and inability to become contextual. When this thing landed from wherever it's from, it was either so repulsive to Porto, causing the ground to bubble beneath and partially separate, or it was so repulsed by Porto that the new ground refuses to fully assimilate. However, an aerial view shows some effort to be contextual, at least with the sightlines. Casa de Musica's travertine paving produces one new ground with 2 new conditions, raised and level, producing 3 natures of ground. Contextual, different but relational, indifferent. The only thing the building seems intent on is holding on to the air stairs common to spacecraft of this generation. Where it fails to assimilate, it excels at connecting to a broader context. As one enters, they are removed from one ground and transported to an alien world. The tangrams that cover the architecturally deadly shoebox are a collection of exotically diverse interiors, fragments from elsewhere, architectural or geographic, not entirely familiar and not entirely foreign. At the apotheosis of this denatured experience is a room muraled in blue and white tile. The tiles could be Portuguese azulejos or Dutch delftware, itself an imitation of Chinese porcelain. By finding something so familiar in this alien object, it produces an encounter with a monster, who proves to be not so foreign and establishes a relationship to a larger cosmopolitan field. This fragmented and ungrounded alien object allows oneself to completely separate from ideas of context. In light of how Rem is exhausted by the production of new, the allegory becomes one that believes things can be rearranged and history preserved or reimagined. This reminds me of Andrew Kovacs, a young architect working in LA. He stages his goods used show as an architectural sale, an act which gives value to the used artifacts of architecture, takes taxonometric record of an exhausted body of architectural work, and imagines new life for past precedents. Kovacs shares Rem's sentiment for the freedom to invent without throwing anything out. I see Kovacs as someone who's interested in a continual churning and redeployment of history. It's a historic preservation free of ethical mandate. Rem's retelling of the Casa de Musica's conception is an allegory for the unstable relationship between form and use. In that way, it allows for flexibility in form's relationship to meaning, allowing willful reuse. The myth highlights the real relationship in architecture as between form and effect. Form's usefulness is that it can be rearranged to make new arguments. Finally, Grimm's myth teaches us that because architectural effects can free us from context, we are no longer slaves to dental contextualism. Freedom from context allows us to make monsters. I love the myth Kouos tells us, mainly because he presupposes that we still aren't old enough to know that monsters are real. Act 4. Baby. I was born this way. Teratology is important to architecture because it gives us the freedom to separate ourselves from Renaissance bodily representations in architecture. Deformations, growths, and monstrous assemblages help unpack this point. Hirsuto's Raspberry Field serves as a prime example of using deformation as a design strategy. It takes the formal incompatibility of a one-room schoolhouse and its conjoined ediculae and covers it in what Payne calls a height of shingles. It produces a bilaterally unsymmetrical deformity that makes the house physically shrivel, curl, and cause one to suspect impending atrophy. Payne tortures us, as he insists the physical deformity is a functional expression caused by purported unequal weathering. From Hirsuto's insistence on two-sidedness is born our two-faced creature, like Janus, in this case with one side protected and one protecting, one preserved and one exposed. The deformation produces a legible internal irregularity in plan, which is a useful device for producing spatial difference in otherwise banal architecture. In Rex's Museum Plaza, he wrongly suggests that this hybrid is a result of folding traditional urban relationships. He's wrong because towers reject the ground's power over them through autopoiesis, or self-production of ground. What's really happening is a typological breeding resembling a hybrid beast like a chimera, rather than a human figure. The chimera is a creature which finds such atypical form from embryologic or topological unfolding, producing a three-headed and four-legged creature like Rex's Museum Plaza. That X-ray further places the specimen as a creature rather than an urban origami. Omei Shenzhen Stock Exchange produces a similar awkward visual effect, reminding one of a finger growing out of a head, but it's also a similar hybrid. The usefulness of the grossly out-of-place block is a large floor for high-frequency trading, where real estate prices for computers is the highest in the world. And it also represents a certain willfulness in Rem's love of blocks and towers. A normal body might suggest this ensemble is freakishly out of place, but teratology insists that this is freakishly normal. Stephen Hull's linked hybrid could also be pulled into this creature conversation. 8 towers emerge from a single block. Near the top, a floating corridor binds the heads of this polycephalous behemoth. The variation in each tower is enough to produce individual creature qualities, solidifying the impression that these things are actually growing, and that it's a monster existing as one in many. It's not that teratology is a new phenomenon in architecture, but historically, such marvelous beasts were forced into hiding. Doug Graff shares the story of the Villa Farnese, which survived the Renaissance only because it is so adept at hiding its fifth side. When the villa grew a fifth side, Vignola redesigned all the approaching views to avoid the awkwardness of seeing 3 sides at once. He made the interior cortile circular and filled it with arches to avoid noting the concentric pentagonal plan. Finally, the 2 back walls are made identical in room configuration, and the gardens onto which they open are doubled. It's a doubling to hide the experience of doubling. There was, however, one towel revealing the secret of this teratological beast. A painting in the Room of Farnese Deeds by Taddeo Zuccari reveals Francis I riding a 2-headed horse. If we followed Francis on this 2-headed horse to his Chateau de Chambord, we would find another monster hiding in the north, a hybrid, joining a marvelous grid of windows with a monstrous aggregation of roof. There's a murky line where teratology ends and where aggregations begin. But I'm interested in how deformation can begin to produce irreconcilable difference. In Moss's After Party, the structure is framed as a found object, a former settlement before some fallout. Moss understands the creature-like qualities of this aggregation and embellishes the monstrous monstrous narrative. The conical structures have the ability to communicate with similar structures. They are clad with ibutu, an extinct hairy thatch, and the structures have been contaminated with a fungus, releasing spores. What I find so interesting about Moss's example is that the formal language of aggregation requires a personality in the story. And secondly, the colony of structures begins to produce extreme topological deformation, able to produce typological difference. The colony of structures begins to produce extreme difference, obscuring similar generic primitive origins. I'm interested in a point where extreme topological deformation would be able to produce typological difference. Justin Dials tells me this is impossible, but I'm hopeful. Part 7. In this section, I will seek to unpack the composite act of architecture and the desirable effects of cloning dead people. In Maison Bordeaux, Rem Koolhaas presumably goes through some effort in creating a composite of Miesian copies. The overall massing of Maison Bordeaux is composed of 3 houses, a literal reproduction of 3 houses taken from Mies's 1938 project group of 3 courthouses, as well as an inversion of one of the schemes. The T-shaped volume in Mies's scheme becomes the void in Aumé's scheme, and the courtyard in Mies's scheme becomes the 3 houses in Bordeaux. The cantilevered volume in Bordeaux floats above the functional plaza below, a literal reproduction of the Miesian diagram for a skyscraper. However, it's a diagram because Maison Bordeaux doesn't appear to have the structure to support the levitating block. On the ground floor in Bordeaux, Rem simply rearranges the interior partitions from a 1934 Mies courtyard house to produce a grotto-esque retreat. Aume preserves the lintels connecting 2 servant quarters to reproduce the complete enclosure found in Mies's courtyard house. In Maison Bordeaux, this enclosure is only achieved by the planar projection above, another reversal of Mies. The hearth in Mies's project pins the house to the ground, creating an origin and connecting earth and sky. Rem replaces this with an elevator core that allows the client maximum mobility. The hearth is no longer a static object that ties architecture to the ground, but architecture is tied to instability, movement, and reproduction of ground. Rem creates an axis mundi, a relationship between earth and sky that literally transports the user. Rem then moves on to structure, borrowing from Mies's crown hall, where trusses suspend the roof from above. On the cantilevered end of Maison Bordeaux, a beam rests on top of the house and appears to be tied to the ground as if in tension. This is the structural equivalent of tying a hot air balloon down, not what is necessary to suspend a concrete house. The other visual structural member looks physically correct, but is a Miesian error. Instead of suspending the structure from above, it takes the pose of Atlas and holds the floating box from below. Both structural members appear to be only half of what they should be, being cantilevers themselves. They might complete each other if they weren't offset in plan. Although the Maison Bordeaux is static, based on the observation that it's standing, the structural expression is dynamic, or that of falling. In Aumé's composite clone, Rem reproduces the necessary architecture to remake an image of Van der Rohe's real house. Koolhaas uses the exact picturesque representation to resolve all uncertainty that Maison Bordeaux has a neoclassical German twin. Rem uses this technique again to emphasize that Mies's sunken sculpture garden from the New National Gallery in Berlin has been transplanted in Bordeaux. The lighting and camera height is unmistakable. The camera turns in Bordeaux to show that the clone is similarly separated from the profane city beyond. Rem rejects the minimal clarity of Mies in this monstrous composite for the sake of being excessively Miesian. There should be no mistake about what more is more means. Maison Bordeaux becomes the possible unreality of the 7-headed Mies. It's a polycephalous clone, producing surrealist error, and through such faithful perversion, Rem inverts everything Mies. Aumé's act in Maison Bordeaux reminds me of Julius Schulman's photography. Take, for instance, the photograph of Pierre Koenig's Stahlhaus. Its sublime quality is unreal. And like Maison Bordeaux, it's a composite. Schulman explains his sleight of hand in producing myth. I set my camera up outside, turned the lights off in the house, and exposed the film for about 7 minutes to capture the lights of the city below. Then we set off a flash inside the house to get the girls on film, and that was it. It's a composite of 2 images, and not something one could reproduce without knowing that they're looking at a 2-headed monster. In Greg Lynn's Slavin House, he performs a similar cloning act, like Brehm does with Mies. In this case, Lynn becomes obsessed with Lina Bobardi's house in Sao Paulo. Lynn is drawn to how the courtyard house makes living space that's both outside and underneath the house, by using the courtyard as a light well rather than figural space. Lynn makes concurrent discoveries that he can update the logic of triviation based on how a computer draws. When a computer draws a square, you get a square plus 4 loops because of the continuous motion in which a computer draws. And the technology for rolled steel beams has existed for decades, allowing Lynn to replace the anachronistic post-lintel construction. The structure of the house is satisfied by 2 500 feet long continuous rolled steel trusses, and the curves from the trusses inform the surfaces of the interior volumes and voids. So when Lynn clones Lina Bobardi's house, it's as if the soft monster living in this computer is updating the form. What you get is this strange cloned hybrid. While Lynn intently copies something else, the only thing that's formally similar is the roof, which in itself is curious. Now that we know that monsters exist and have been hiding in plain sight, what do we do? In my own work, I'd like to explore a hybrid approach between those of Kuas and Lynn. Kuas refuses to discard history, but rather reuses recognizable devices and motifs to produce alternative narratives. I also admire the approach of Greg Lynn, whose interest in history is for a constant disciplinary update, which I liken to Victor Frankenstein reanimating dead tissue. In a studio for Lisa Tilder, Melissa Poppelman, John Myers, and myself began experimenting with the ideas of repurposing, excess, and reanimating architectural tissue by remaking Ome's Parc de la Villette. Using fragments from quintessential postmodern and contemporary projects, we faithfully reproduce the model, representation, and documentation of Parc de la Villette. Yet, in spite of our faith, we produced a very different but lovable offspring. It was legibly historic and legibly devious. It was an experience that taught me that copying inherently produces difference. Our first monster led us to produce another evil twin, this time of OMA's Très Grande Bibliothèque. OMA's Très Grande Bibliothèque void model exploits the object-like representation of absence, and we further solidified the spatial inversion by tarring and feathering it with the taxonomy of contemporary work. The absent floor plates become a memory of our own Parc de la Villette, as the striping is projected onto the surface of the elevator course. The Hall of Ascension became Herzog and Demeron's Gabillon floor, making congregation precarious. The void which produces movement and plan became a train intersecting NVRDV's Pig City Slaughterhouse, complete with acrylic carcasses. Almay's spiral is covered in raspberry field shingles and becomes the floor of the Lusian Love Hotel, home to miniature Stonehenge and plastic Coon's puppies. However wild the combinations we have created, I will insist that they were not random, but carefully controlled and curated to produce new relationships and meanings. In a recent competition entry for a port terminal in Keelung, Taiwan, I moved away from having the framework of remaking models, but instead used an aggregation of pieces and precedents to compose a collection of architectural effects. The mass of the terminal floats above a plaza, reminiscent of Kesha form, and a Hirshhorn-esque balloon is a deflated dome, possibly supporting the pleated shell. The pleated roofs recall the draping skins of Tom Maine, or recent projects fetishizing domesticity. The pleats work to break up the massing of an enormous bar, and one pleat grows to satisfy the programmatic requirement for a tower. The pleat itself recalls its relationship to the ply, or the fold, and the pliancy of form. The one-eyed tower turns to make a gesture towards the city, and the bar absorbs the consequence of the turn. The tower or head elevates itself, floating above the city. A mouth appears, and a tongue falls onto the plaza. As subjects enter from the land side, they are consumed by architecture and will soon be marveling at an exotically rich interior. Disembarking passengers, after already having their fill of visual stimulation from the graphic exterior, are spit out onto the streets of Helin in an act of architectural catharsis, a grand exit after a cross-strait journey. What I found successful about this project was the intricate connection, or complicated folding of denatured architectural fragments. It's a collection of architecture for Helin that will naturalize in time and make Helin like nothing else. In my exit review project, I wanted to imagine the Helin project without the program. The collection of fragments resolved as a building in Helin becomes an aggregation of generic primitives here. I wanted to lose the method of piecing fragments together, but imagine that my primitives could genetically unfold to produce difference, or a topological unfolding to produce irreconcilable typological difference that Justin told me is impossible. While I think this needs development, the genetic unfolding of the once generic polycubes produces specificity that creates sets of relationships. As they become individuals, they become inseparable from the whole, and once again lose their identity, becoming a devious, devastatingly charming composition. The representation isn't a juxtaposition of difference, but adds the missing line work to Impressionism. The line drawing gains from the multiple and disembodied viewpoints of Degas and emphasizes the question of one or many, both in terms of my project and the dancers. The choice of dancers exploits the linguistic relationship between the complication of my aggregation and the plie of the dancers. Complication implies a folding. Here, the inseparable network of bodies, while the plie refers to the folding of the dancers' legs, while their backs remain rigid. My primitives curiously duplicate this plie, or plie, as well. At a certain point, I've realized that the projects I'm interested in are about aggregation of form, precedent, and partial narratives that become connected through a curation based on similarities. The monster is an apt paradigm because it's a post-humanist argument that doesn't abandon bodies, but allows us to understand architecture through inverted relationships, deformation, dubious genetics, and more heads and fewer eyes than is typical. Monsters substantiate a bodily relationship for excess, aggregations, composites, and assemblages. Monsters pose an argument that is about more than just synthesis. Monsters are about more than difference that is easily absorbed or digested. The question isn't whether everything is a monster either. Monsters imply intentionality and skill in producing desired form and effect, and in that way are very specific. Monsters don't suffer from the presence of other monsters, but create families, exotically diverse, each demanding careful inspection. Monsters are not icons, but range in terms of subtleness and excess. Monsters are a labyrinthine method for recombinance. Monsters are appropriate for architecture as a creative discipline, as they're also analogous to the horror we often find in our own work. Finally, architecture can produce monsters because this is a discipline that experiments. It experiments like Greg Lynn and Victor Frankenstein, who reanimate dead tissue. It experiments like Rem, who inverts history, copies, and reuses, finding a loose fit for his fetishes. And it experiments like me, as I try to find a fit for both methods. Architecture as a hybrid act means most basic and maybe most difficult task, which is figuring out how to make necessary building components like doors and windows make a relationship with the architecture. Michael Meredith appropriately defines architecture as the cage we build ourselves. And Bataille says the ultimate architecture is the labyrinth, for its ability to produce endlessness and always turning away from itself. I'm interested in an architecture that is both labyrinth and monster. Endless in methodology and possibilities, but otherwise monstrous. He who fights with monsters might take care, lest he thereby become a monster. When you gaze longing to an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Thank you.